first choice. But after living in the US for some years, then they come back to Mexico and they become English teachers. And over the years, we have witnessed how transnationals and returnees are subject of dominant discourses and become invisible to the educational system, and their experiences, values, and linguistic capital become subject of mocking, discrimination, and rupture. And this is what we're going to show you today. So today we will present part of the work we've been doing for the last years, and we will start by addressing the main concepts we're using to discuss our data. Then we will briefly talk about our motivation to do this research. After that, we will present some figures to set the context and our methodology. We will continue with our findings, discussion, and we will end with our conclusions and suggestions for implications. But to start with, we need to address this idea of Sentipensar as an expression of the colonial thinking. Arturo Escobar proposes the notion of Sentipensar, Sentipensar con el territorio, which implies thinking with the heart and with the mind, or corazonar. He adopts the term from Borda, who borrowed it from the communities that live near the rivers in northern Colombia, who make up what is known as la cultura ribereña, or the culture of the peoples of the rivers. Borda enriches the notion of sentipensante, pointing that ribereños reflect and think with their heart in intimate relation to and in balance with their immediate natural environment. And for his part, Escobar tells us that Sentipensar points to the forms in which territorialized communities have learned the art of living, which we can translate into how they wave life, or tejen vida, as they interact with their immediate environment. And in the same vein, Saturnino de la Torre emphasizes that Sentipensar implies a dialogue between feeling and thinking to understand reality based on the multiple ways we perceived, act, feel, interact, and think. And it is in this sense where language becomes an important element. Ale?
So all of these features that we've just mentioned interact to give us a deeper understanding of human beings and their experience in the world. So as we know, our way of being and behaving is directly projected in the way we think, feel, and in the way we use language, or in the way of languaging, to give this essence of the process that we follow when we use language. So therefore, language becomes a central process, or languaging becomes a central process that connects our thoughts and feelings, or that leads us to Sentipensar, which is the core concept we are dealing with in this presentation. So the dynamics that bring together our individual and collective tools and resources, our local practices regarding language, allows us to make sense of the world, to connect with the world, to connect with others around us, and also to gain, to make sense of knowledge, to share this knowledge, and particularly to continue articulating and building it.
So Miñolo reminds us that se es de donde se piensa, or one is where one thinks, and we extend this notion to se es de donde se piensa, se siente y se actúa. Therefore, drawing from a decolonizing perspective, we aim to raise awareness on how to rethink learning spaces for understanding and learning from multiple ways of collaborating and interacting with each other within the educational space. And as I mentioned before, this is within teacher education programs where these returnees and transnationals interact in a given time and space in their lives. So based on data from two contexts, and we're going to give you more detail a little bit later on Guanajuato and Zacatecas, we have witnessed how transnationals and returnees are subject of dominant discourses and become invisible to the educational system. Their experiences, values, and linguistic capital become subject of mocking, discrimination, and rupture, as I mentioned before. And the phenomenon is multi-layered, as there seems to be a continuum where emotions move constantly and ambivalently from the optimism end to the pessimism end of the spectrum. There are different dimensions in which we can contextualize the origin of these discourses. For example, we can talk about political, social, educational, and individual, to mention just a few. But in order to understand the context of our study, it is important to address two concepts, which are return migrants and transnationals. Return migrant refers to the person who was born in Mexico, goes or is taken to the US by his or her parents, and years later comes back to Mexico or the country of origin with the objective to settle down there after spending a considerable amount of time in another country. But it is important to say that the return can be voluntary or forced.
In addition to this term of return migrants, we also have the term transnationals, which makes reference to people or individuals who also have a history of migration. But what characterizes them is that they have significant ties to two or more nation states. So their experiences, the way they live their lives, is usually suspended between two worlds. They involve at least two places of residence. They use at least two languages. They are familiar and become familiar with at least two different cultures and two literacy frameworks. So therefore, their experiences become very unique, highly complex. And this leads to the emergence of a diversity of profiles and trajectories, because they move around these spaces in a very dynamic way. So it's a very particular type of identity that emerges and develops in their case. So now to tell you a little bit about the context where we collected the data that we will be presenting today. As you may know, there is a huge flow of migrants from Mexico to the US. Sometimes, or it is frequently thought, that this flow of migration is quite unidimensional, meaning that migrants from Mexico have the same profile, the same context, the same story, or that they come from a place in common. However, there are many different regions of migration in Mexico, as you see them here in the map. And the places where we conducted our research, Zacatecas and Guanajuato, belong to the region that is called the traditional or the historical region of migration in Mexico. So it's the center north part of the country. And these were the first places in Mexico where train rails began to be built. And that's why it was very, very highly connected with the US. So a lot of the migration that we've seen over the years has developed in this region, having families do this as an activity, almost as a tradition, migrating to the US for many years. So the profiles of migrants, either returnees or transnationals who come from this area, is very, very different and very unique because of all this history and traditional ways of looking at migration. So Guanajuato and Zacatecas are very special places because also when we look at the figures that give us information about migration, we can see that these are places where there is a very high intensity of migration. In fact, Zacatecas is one of the highest. Here we have some figures. Guanajuato comes in 4th place. So they are in the top 5 states in Mexico where we see a very, very high degree of migratory intensity. And this has been constant for the last 2 centuries. Can we go to the next, please? Thank you. But even though these places share some characteristics and some similarities because they belong to the traditional or historical region of migration, they also have particularities. For example, in this figure here, we see how Guanajuato is one of the places that receives the most returnee population. So a lot of those migrants who actually return to Mexico as Irasema said, either because it is a forced return or a voluntary return, they come back to Guanajuato, their place of origin. And this is different to Zacatecas. Zacatecas has a more circular dynamic. That's why we refer to our participants from Zacatecas as transnationals, because they do have a different type of profile. And they tend to be connected and to have a more dynamic movement throughout their lives and throughout their trajectories. So as we were mentioning, in terms of some of the similarities that Guanajuato and Zacatecas share, another important feature is that the places where migrants go and live or where they become residents in the US and where they spend most of their lives as migrants are, for example, Texas, California, and Illinois. Those are 3 states that concentrate the most part of the population from these Mexican states. And also the numbers of people who are born in Guanajuato and Zacatecas who later become residents in the US, as you can see in the green graph here for León, Celaya, Fresnillo, Rio Grande. So the percentages of births of people who are born in these places is quite similar, as you can see in the percentages. So they do have dissimilarities and they do share this part of the characteristics. So now to tell you a little bit about the methodology of our research. So we followed a qualitative research paradigm. As I've been explaining, we conducted and collected the data in 2 different states of Mexico, which are Guanajuato and Zacatecas, the central part of Mexico and the center north part of Mexico. We had, for Guanajuato, 15 participants, and for Zacatecas, 23 transnational youth. We used a narrative platform for the collection of the data. In the case of Irasema, she used a narrative inquiry, and I used a case study. And of course, we follow very strict ethical protocols that included the use of pseudonyms to guarantee the confidentiality of our participants, their identities, the information they provided, and also the use of consent letters to use the information they provided.
Okay, and now we're going to present the findings. And just to remind you that both studies took place in 2 BA programs, which are related to English language teaching. So the first one that we have, we start with these 2 extracts that we have classified as mocking, related to racism among Latinos, perpetuation of violence, classism, or dislocation of returnees and transnationals. We have 2 participants, one is from Guanajuato and the other one is from Zacatecas. But in the case of Edgar, who is from Guanajuato, this happened when he was in the US, and in the case of Sasha, who is from Zacatecas, it happened when she arrived in Mexico. In the case of Edgar, he mentions this part when he felt, well, when he experienced bullying by his peers. And remember that this happened when he was in the US. And he mentioned something very important here by saying, I learned a lot in very little time, but I was bullied by all my peers. It was sort of a funny thing though, because the peers I thought would aid me were the ones that would give me the hardest time. And for him, it was Latinos. So for him, it says, all I received were shrugs when I asked what something meant or how to pronounce, because he was constantly bullied because of his pronunciation or because of his lack of knowledge of English at the time. So then that's when he decided that he would become much better in English. In the case of Sasha, we can see how a teacher who is supposed to provide a safe environment and help her to develop her Spanish in Mexico did nothing but to laugh about what she said or because of her Spanish. When she came back, she was in a private school, and she mentioned they used to say, oh, it is because your family is poor. That's why you came back, and things like that. And I was like, well, I don't really like this. And I remember the teacher made fun of me because of a word I spelled wrong, which is the word significa. And I put significa, but with a Z. And she laughed, and I didn't understand why until later on. And I was like, oh my gosh. So in these cases, we can see how they experienced in both sides of the border or on both sides of the border, they experienced difficult moments, not only with their peers, but also with teachers in this case. Then our next extracts are show more positive attitudes our participants found during their stay in the US. And we have, for example, in the case of Gema, another participant from Guanajuato, and she remembered one particular teacher who she felt that it was helpful at the time. She was helpful in the sense that she was very patient and very kind. And she said she taught me how to acknowledge my mistakes, embrace them in order to grow from them, whether it was in an English class or in everyday life. I will put into practice to write down all the words I don't understand and look for the meaning and reread where I first had contact with the word. It has helped me both in English and in Spanish. And in the case of Sasha, she makes this comparison between the system between Mexico and the US. And she says, cuando me voy allá, pues todo muy distinto, porque allá el método de enseñanza es muy distinto. Y aquí las maestras en el kinder, yo no estaba enamorada de mis maestras en el kinder. Llego a Estados Unidos y son un amor. And that's when she said, for example, that I want to be like them when I grow up. Because she even says that the method was very different, and because they were very patient and they explain everything and the activities are completely different. Then we have this other theme, which we called bridging two worlds and the recognition of a teacher and classmates of what Sasha brought to the classroom. And it was very important to acknowledge this because this is in the moment that Sasha could share not only with her classmates, but also with the teacher, what she had experienced in both countries. She was able to make connections with both cultures, with both languages and knowledges. And she mentioned something when she was in a class, and then la maestra dice, cada quien va a poner una canción que les agrade. So a classmate put a song of Britney Spears, and she started to sing, and everybody started to sing as well. And then when it was her turn, then she chose a song which is very popular in Mexico, and everybody started to sing. And then the teacher, that's when she asked, Sasha, ¿tú viviste toda tu vida en Estados Unidos? Y le digo, no, maestra, tengo años que viví en Estados Unidos y tengo tantos años que viví aquí. Y me dice, es que veo que conoces de ambas cosas. So it was until this moment that she was able to say or to show that she knew about both cultures in both countries and both languages, because they were talking, as she says here, they were talking about Rebelde, which was a popular soap opera here in Mexico. And then they changed and they were talking about That's So Raven or Nickelodeon or Disney Channel. And then they switched back and they were talking about El Chavo, which was a very popular program in Mexico. So then she was making this constant back and forth between what she knew in both countries.
So far in this extracts that we have presented, we see this movement between feeling and thinking, which is very important to keep in mind. We see these transitions that people are making not only physically by being in different places, but also mentally and in terms of their emotions. So now I will present to you this other extract that we've called Facing Rejection, that talks about discrimination, the emotions, the feelings, and the thoughts that emerge because of the experience of discrimination. In this case, this is an extract of a story that took place in Mexico. Again, we're quoting Sasha here. So she says that she never suffered discrimination. She never felt discriminated against when she was in the US until she came back to Mexico. She started to experience rejection from her peers, from her teachers. Perhaps it was a discrimination that was not very clear or very explicit, but it was demonstrated in the actions they took towards her. So for example, they would speak very, very slowly to her because they thought she wouldn't understand Spanish. The teacher would even tell her not to read or not to do certain homeworks or certain activities so that she wouldn't be bothered or that she wouldn't have difficulty, she wouldn't struggle. Y le decía esta frase, ¿no? Si quiere usted no lea tanto, que es tan significativa viniendo de un maestro que le diga a un estudiante que no lea, que no se acerque a sus libros, ¿no? Entonces también desde ahí cortando esa conexión con su sistema de alfabetización y de ir entendiendo este nuevo sistema educativo. So she would reflect on this. She would think a lot about all of these actions, what they meant, how they made her feel. And she wasn't able to find answers. She says, no sé por qué me tratarían así. She didn't understand. It was something that she was constantly asking herself and trying to find an answer for. And sadly, she also faced rejection in terms of people not speaking to her. So not only alienating her and isolating her from academic activities or tasks in the classroom, but people even didn't talk to her. She says, nadie se me acercaba porque venía de Estados Unidos. Entonces era como la frase que le decían, ay, viene de Estados Unidos, no le hablen. And this is how she recalls feeling discriminated against. We also have this other example from Laura, who recalls a story about becoming an English teacher. So again, we see how this capital that transnationals or returnees acquire because of their history of migration becomes an asset and becomes very valuable for the new context where they are settling or inserting at certain stages of their trajectories and their lives. So in this case, she narrates how a teacher would give her the responsibility of teaching the class because she knew English. So the teacher said, well, you know how to do it. Why don't you help me? And she felt a very heavy responsibility on her shoulders. And she even, now that she's studying in the teaching program, she says, nunca les pediría eso a mis alumnos. Eso es poco profesional o no es profesional. To give that responsibility to a student who is just arriving, who is so young to take on this job of the teacher. Y vemos nuevamente el tema de las emociones. She says, it's not something that you like to feel. No es agradable. It's not something that you like to experience. So again, we see these participants trying to make sense and trying to connect their emotions to their thoughts and these rational processes that they have to go through really quickly and really abruptly when they are found in these liminal spaces and in these contexts of interaction and exchange of different kinds of systems.
Well, now in an attempt to represent what we have found in our data, we try to visualize a diagram where we can explain these different forces coexisting. We come back to the idea of Sentipensar as it signals a different type of rationality by which people are able to account for their immediate environment, history, and identity. In our diagram, the dotted lines indicate the transit constructions happening in specific moments in their lives, during their time in the US, when they come back to Mexico and were inserted in the Mexican educational system as learners, and also during their teacher education program, where they are now learning how to become English teachers. And following Escobar, I mean, he highlights different ways of being or formas de ser, and that is the multiplicity of ways in which different people live life in close interaction and interdependence with their immediate environment as ontologies. And they are tejiendo vida or weaving life as they interact with their immediate environment. And here there are two forces, thinking and feeling, which we see as two complementing sides of the ontological understanding of life. Intention, but at the same time to preserve an ontological equilibrium. And we intend to open a new way of reflection and understanding of the training process in teacher education programs in line with a society in permanent change and with the thriving ecosystem conceptions. An education that looks to the future cannot continue clinging to the transmission of knowledge that is fragmented and far from reality. And also, likewise, the role of emotions, as Alejandra was mentioning, we can see them as energies that generate change and knowledge, and this should be underlined. And it is invited to think in terms of training rather than instruction. So we see education as a process of transformation in coexistence, where the learner is transformed together with the teachers and with the other classmates with whom he or she lives in his or her educational space, both in terms of transformations in the explicit or conscious dimension, as in the implicit or unconscious dimension. So in this sense, it is from this coexistence that the dimensions of being and doing and thinking and feeling mold each other, and at every moment influence the actions, behaviors of the learners and teachers as well. And following Maturana, when he talks about emotions, he mentions that they shape the operation of intelligence and open and close the path for possible consensus to be established in our daily lives. So in this sense, and in the diagram that we try to represent, we can say that educational environments are spaces for actions and reflections based on emotions and feelings that circulate, but they are generated in the coexistence of one with the others. So in this case, their environments, these environments in which we transform ourselves according to the flow of our emotions, and this is when we take into account the thinking and feeling. And to educate, to feel and think is to configure a pleasant space for coexistence. And as we saw in the data, it is very difficult to find this type of spaces. We saw how participants were discriminated. Very few times they were acknowledged in the sense of the knowledge that they bring to the classroom, but in some others they were given a lot of responsibility, for example, to become the teachers of their classmates. So educating to feel, thinking is creating circumstances that enhance and enrich the capacity for action and reflection of the learning subject. And it is to form the other on the path of empathy, of solidarity and acceptance of the other, commitment to the task, and the enthusiasm for the action being developed. So then it means that here, Sentipensar is a concept that reflects the educational projection of the ecosystem, the ecosystem paradigm or complexity, and the reflections and theoretical constructions of the complexity find their best expression in this concept, we think, by fusing in a single act of meaning the process of thought, emotion, and we add action. And with it, we wanted to translate and transfer to education the need to integrate the simple and the complex, the order and the chaos, or contemplating reality, not as a continuum of opposite, but complementary. So it is with order and chaos, resistance and change, and utopia and reality that we express this idea of Sentipensar.
So all of these theoretical perspectives that we have on what is going on based on the data that we found, we want to give it a meaning and to make it practical. What does this mean for programs, in this case in Mexico, who train future language teachers or future teachers in general, as in the case of escuelas normales? So what it means and what we want to promote is a deeper reflection on the way we see migration. Migration, this phenomenon is not going away, and it's something that is at the core of the way our country functions and the way our country moves. So seeing migration not as a problem, but somehow as a solution and as a way of integrating and bringing new opportunities that could represent actual advantages in terms of pedagogical aspects, values, culture, and all of these assets that migration and people who have a history of migration bring to these programs and to the country. And obviously, by having this reflection and changing or shifting the way we see migration and the way we interact with people who go through this experience and who have these trajectories, this would have implications for teacher training. So as Irasema was mentioning, how are we going to train? How are we going to bring empathy and the notion of emotion, action linked to thinking and our critical processes of learning? How are we going to bring this in the way we teach teachers, in the way we train them to become more empathic and to deal with people who have these two places of reference and two areas of reference, two aspects of reference in the case of transnationals and return migrants, and how is it that we're going to build and think about the design of programs in education in general.
So talking about some implications, what these participants experience have to do with their invisibility in the educational system. And we can discuss some implications that we have seen in three levels. At the macro level, that of the State Federation through the General Education Law, and the institutions of the federal entity with competence in education and migration. For example, here in Guanajuato, we have a Secretaría del Migrante y Enlace Internacional. But the General Education Law, in its Article 38, states that basic education in its three levels will have the accommodations required to respond to the linguistic and cultural characteristics of each of the various indigenous groups in the country, as well as the dispersed rural population and migratory groups. That's what it says on paper, but they ignore that the latter are characterized by a high heterogeneity. And they don't specify which are those linguistic and cultural adaptations that must be adopted with the so-called migratory groups, or how they must be applied. And there is a considerable divorce between what students experience and learn in life and the curriculum models used in the classroom. So also the law does not contemplate teacher training in attention to migrant students. At the meso level, where the school curriculum is located, the invisibility of returning students is highly manifested regarding the language of instruction and communication and study content, as we saw in the data. We are talking about children who migrated to the US being infants and who have returned to Mexico in their adolescence or in being young adults. So much or practically all their vital experience has been developed in the US and in English. When coming back to Mexico, they arrive in a new educational environment based on the elements of monoculturalism and monolingualism. Many of them arrive without knowing how to read or write in Spanish, as we saw, for example, with Sasha. Others have no problems with English and Spanish, but for some others, English is their dominant language. So the main language of these students is completely absent in the curriculum. This leads us to the micro level, where we locate the classroom praxis, where at times teachers are indifferent to the value of these transnationals bring to the classroom. These teachers might be detractors who see diversity as a problem, or they might be indifferent as they do not realize the existence of diversity in the classroom. But we can also find those who are propositional and appreciate diversity as a pedagogical advantage. And this implies that these three levels need to coexist and to align their motivations and practices. Obviously, this will require changes at the macro level so that they should have an impact on the other articulated levels, which are the meso and the micro. And incorporation of teacher training programs across Mexico in attention to migrant students, as well as cross-sectional studies and longitudinal ones on education are necessary. And it is important then to try to engage the student and the educator in a shared process of construction of learning, both for the student and the teacher. So we think that that the Sentipensar concept provides us with a new vision of training, understood as change and as this inner transformation, incorporating skills, attitudes, values, beliefs, as well as knowledge. And also, it attends to the processes without discarding the results. And to speak of feeling and thinking in education is to speak of processes, of interactions between the inner world and that of external stimuli that make us think about what is happening in what they are experiencing. The teaching action is a facilitator and mediator, as well as the environments. So all these levels need to be articulated so that teacher education programs can help and actually bring to life what the law says, because so far we see that something is what is written on paper, but something completely different is what is done in reality. So, and obviously an educational reform must have as principle or a main priority to re-enchant education, and that can be only achieved through the fusion between emotion, thought, and action.
So to wrap up this presentation, we want to leave you with these points to keep in mind. So to bring reflection about how is it that we can resignify the experience of this returnee and transnational population in our country and in other contexts where this could be applied as well. The validation of the linguistic capital that these individuals possess. For example, in terms of the way they use language, their flexible linguistic practices, translanguaging, the use of Spanglish, any linguistic practice that they bring with themselves and that is part of their identity and their trajectory. The appropriation of these liminal spaces where they are suspended and these liminal spaces that they inhabit, because it is there where they have knowledge. It is there where they articulate knowledge and where we find a lot of value in what they can bring into programs and in general to the educational system. Also thinking about creativity. What does this mean for teachers, for students? How can we use the knowledge and the values that these students or these individuals have to form or to think of new strategies to articulate knowledge? That goes hand in hand with their bicultural capital. So we've seen how they are connected to at least 2 places, elements, systems. So all of this capital that they have in terms of culture and language use, how that can scaffold their way into articulating new knowledge. And well, finally, focusing on the construction of knowledge based on returnee and transnational ways of living, languaging, being, and resisting.
So these are our references, and this is where you can contact us, and we are open to any question, comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Doctora Mora-Pablo and Doctora Núñez Asomoza, Irasema and Alejandra. That was a lot of really meaningful data that is probably mostly new to a lot of the audience, especially, you know, the distortion of what happens to kids when they go back or they're in their, you know, migration cycles in and out of Zacatecas, and how teachers do and don't receive them. So I have a lot of thoughts and ideas, but I want to invite the audience to use the Q&A for whatever questions or clarifications you might like to see. You know, maybe it's about the data that were presented, maybe it's about this idea of Sentipensar, maybe it's about their implications, or maybe you have just some insights you'd like to share. So please do use the Q&A for those who are in the audience. That's what it's there for. I'll be moderating for any of the questions that come in. But one question that I wanted to start with was, how did you two decide to connect on the data that you had from Zacatecas and Guanajuato? What was the spark between you on that issue?
Well, thank you, Sue. Well, I have known Alejandra for many years, and when she was finishing her PhD, then well, we were always in touch, always in communication, and then we saw that we had a very similar research interests. And then when she came back, she was in Zacatecas, and then she was conducting studies very similar to what I was doing here in Guanajuato. So then we decided, like, is this an English program? Yes, it is also for teachers. And then we saw that our participants were very similar. And so we decided that it would be a good idea to combine the data and to share our results and to see what's going on. Because as Ale mentioned in the presentation, Guanajuato and Zacatecas are some of the most representative states in terms of migration and circular migration as well. So then we saw that something was happening there, and also because of the Bajío area, we had many students who come here also because we have many automotive companies here, and either they work in call centers or they become English teachers or they end up working in those companies. So it was a very similar context, and that's why we decided to work together. And now Alejandra is here in Guanajuato.
Okay, that's really useful. I'm going to start with a question kind of about the data that just came in. Why were the participants bullied or not accepted by their peers when they returned to Mexico? Also, why were their peers not helpful to others who had gone through the same experiences? I think the person asking the question is referring to in the US context.
Well, there are many different factors as to why this happens. In the case of Farah, who is one of the participants that I interviewed, she was talking about, for example, this notion of class and migration having to do with money and success understood in terms of having money and this idea of the American dream where you come back with cars and presents for everyone and all of this physical or tangible proofs that you've made it there. So the fact that she returned, even though she constantly went back and forth, but for her peers, the fact that she was here, it meant that she had failed, that her family had failed, and that they were in the same situation. So it was somehow a way of marking the fact that they were not successful, like, okay, you didn't make it. So sort of like a punishment. You came back, you're here, and now you have to suffer somehow for this return. Irasema, I don't know if you would like to add about anything.
Yes, they have very similar experiences. And also one factor that I guess that triggers this bullying or mocking is their level of Spanish. Sometimes they come back with a very marked accent in Spanish because English is their dominant language for many years. And when they come back, they are subject of mocking or peers. I mean, they might be children, they might be teenagers, that they are in that special age where they make fun of everything. But these returnees or transnationals, they are the perfect target for them because of this distinctive way of speaking, and also because it's ignorance on the side of the people that they take for granted that, well, you were in the US, you came back and you're showing off because you speak English. and it's completely different. They don't realize all the struggles that they go through while they were there, but now when they are here in Mexico.
Okay, thanks for responding there. There's a question from Isaac Frausto Hernandez, who says, for those of us who engage in ongoing migrating practices, what would you recommend for us who seek to advocate for our practices within the classroom as students? And how can we encourage, promote an assets-based perspective as students?
I would say that there are different ways of doing it. And that's why we mentioned these 3 different levels. I mean, like the macro, the meso, and the micro, because it might be very difficult to change the macro. I mean, in our hands, it's difficult to do that. But at the micro level, as teachers and students, but especially in these teacher education programs, in this context that we are discussing, we can talk about, for example, didactic strategies that allow the use of different types of languages, for example, English and Spanish, or that stimulate experiences or curiosities, or that promote initiatives that rescue life stories, specifically to acknowledge what they have experienced during their lives. These type of strategies can be like creative or innovative in the classroom, but also collaborative. And I think that here the key word is collaboration, in the sense that we need to acknowledge that we have migrant students in the classroom, but we also have, being here in Mexico, we have Mexican students who haven't had the opportunity to go to another country. So then from a point of view of collaboration and constructivist point of view, we can see that this could be flexible or adaptable to different contexts, and that make possible, I would say, new emergences and transcendences, in the sense that we can acknowledge both, or this multiculturality in the classroom.
If I may add something to that, I think that it's also very important to think about of representation. For instance, those teachers who were migrants or who are migrants or who have gone through that experience, the fact that they are in the classroom teaching, and the fact that they can use, for example, Spanglish in their class, and that they carry out their actual flexible linguistic practices, or that they show their authentic selves to their students, I think it's something that is going to inspire students to also show who they are, and to feel represented somehow, to know that there's space for them to carry out all of these activities, and to be themselves, to show and express their identities freely. So that way, as teachers, we would be validating not only our own experiences of migration, our own complexities in terms of identities, but we would also be validating that of our students. And I think this is a path that is going to lead to this resignification of the entire experience of this population.
If I can be so bold as to add, I love the question where the student is the one with the agency. So thanks, Isaac, for that. Something I did, I'm just going to very briefly add about my own experience. I had a Fulbright Award at the Universidad Autónoma del Estado de Hidalgo in 2017 for a year, and I worked with pre-service teachers similar to what's being presented here, and I also had many similar findings. But when I had students bring literature and film representing transnational experiences, and there's been a lot of media coverage inside Mexico, even printed in the United States, or short documentaries that can be used. And I found my students felt, the transnational ones felt very liberated and finally sort of represented, because it's so hidden, even though it's this hidden in plain sight skill set, just as our panelists have very appropriately expressed in this presentation tonight. So that's my very brief addition to that great question. And I can go on to a kind of similar question, just see if you can extend, and you kind of addressed it here from Angelina. In your opinion, are there any approaches to create welcoming and inclusive classrooms to support students returning and transnational?
Yeah, I think that there are different ways of doing it, but it means that we really need to work with teachers in teacher training programs, because we might find, or I mean, during these years, we can find, or we have found different type of teachers. I mean, the ones that we call like the detractors, who see diversity as a problem, or those that like are more indifferent in the sense that, okay, so you're here, well, we're not going to take you into account. But there are others who are more propositional. And I think that we need more of those teachers, or more teachers who really appreciate diversity and take it as a pedagogical advantage instead of a problem. Because I think that that is something that we can do from the teacher education programs, and to encourage our student teachers to appreciate this multiculturality and diversity that they can find in their classrooms. Because now, for example, here in Bajío, we have not only English and Spanish as the languages that coexist in a classroom, we have also Japanese, because of all these different automotive companies that we have in Bajío, in Guanajuato, in Zacatecas, in Hidalgo. It is very common to have Japanese students as well in the classroom. So it's not like the type of classroom or the traditional classroom that we knew from years ago. Now we have even German students in the classroom. So then this multiculturality is not anymore, is not only English and Spanish. So we're adding more and more languages. So then I think it is very important in teacher education programs to form propositional teachers instead of detractor teachers.
Perhaps we could also think about the design of materials, again, in terms of representation. What are the readings? What are the materials that are we bringing into our classrooms and that we're showing to our students? What are the actual practices that we follow? And what is our idea of migration? I think that sometimes in Mexico, we have this idea of migration as something that is here, but it's somehow not part of our lives, or that is not actually happening in the close context. So having and opening up more conversations about these experiences, bringing this stories and making people aware of narratives such as the ones that we've shown, I think would visibilize and sensitize people a lot more. So I think there's a huge challenge for us researchers to bring this down to schools, institutions, our friends, even the people around us, to get to know about what is going on and to rethink about the phenomenon of migration in Mexico and all the implications that it has and all the context and layers that it touches.
Thank you for those, continually thoughtful responses. Sandra Candel asks, and I think we could spend a lot of time here, and I already have follow-up questions, but the rest of the audience, please continue asking questions and follow-ups. She says, I conducted research with transnational students in Tijuana several years ago with astonishing similar findings. This said, how is the Secretaría de Educación planning to incorporate professional development for teachers that takes into consideration what I term a transnational sensitivity for teachers? Any steps being taken at the federal, state, or local levels? Thank you. Great presentation.
Well, at the federal state, I don't think that something has been done yet, but I can talk about some states that have taken important steps in considering teacher education programs as that source where we can help migrants. And I know, for example, that in Morelos, they are taking, from the Secretaría del Estado, they are taking the steps in training teachers from, or students from the escuelas normales, when they take these diplomados of sensitivity in terms of knowing how to conduct their classes when they have migrant teachers. And I mean, just by opening the conversation with them, it gives them another sense of, or actually acknowledging that they have this type of students. Here in Guanajuato, for example, with the Secretaría del Migrante, which is at the state level, they are trying to do something as well, but this is at a very initial stage, and they are together with the University of Guanajuato. But still, they also need to work with the escuelas normales, because escuelas normales are the teacher, or they are going to provide the teachers who first receive this type of students in primary schools or in the middle school as well. So then it is a conjunct effort between public universities, escuelas normales, and the government or state government in this case, because at the federal level, there is nothing on paper that actually validates this type of actions.
I don't know, Alejandra, if you had anything you wanted to add.
Well, talking about the context of Zacatecas, there have been attempts to sensitize teachers and to, create and design programs that would address these issues. But unfortunately, as we know, with the change of governments and the way things are organized, sometimes at the political level, it hasn't been really successful or formal. Zacatecas has a lot of migrant clubs, so people who collaborate, for example, in California or Illinois or Texas, but it's actually migrants themselves putting together programs, sending money, trying to organize with the people in their hometowns to try to do something, and in this case, to integrate or to provide some kind of connection with communities on both sides of the border. But it has been mainly an effort of those migrant clubs and migrants themselves.
My first follow-up is two-pronged, and I don't know where you might want to enter the question, but one is, what are you two doing that might be different when you're preparing future teachers? And I realize it depends on the subject matter that you're teaching. If it's basics of English grammar, that might be more complicated. I don't know, or not. Maybe you can introduce a lot of cool stuff about translanguaging or something. So how are you personally trying to reframe the teaching to, down the trail, benefit the transnational and returnee students who will arrive to these Mexican classrooms? And the other question is, and I don't want to take you off guard, so maybe you have an expansive answer or maybe a very limited one, but what do you envision really robust pre-service teaching looking like on a broader scale? Because you can only do so much right there at the Universidad de Guanajuato with a very particular context. But what would be sort of your premier edition of what, really improving the preparation of English teachers in Mexico so that they have these sensitivities and build on the capital that you very rightly recognize that these youth bring into classrooms?
Well, I think this is a very important question, Sue. In my case, within the teacher education program I'm part of, I teach specifically one class which is related to social linguistics. And for many years, many students have said, but why is this subject part of the curriculum in a teacher education program? I don't see the connection or things like those. But in social linguistics, I usually dedicate some lessons to talk about bilingualism, or bilingual education, but also about transnationalism. And now that with the years that I've been able to publish more about the topic, I include those articles in the class, because for them, it is different to see what has been done, for example, in the States or in other countries, but to see something that has been done in Mexico within the same program that they are studying. So then it is different. And I have seen, for example, that they take a different approach. And that's when they say, yes, I have student like this, or I have student with these characteristics, or I have similar experiences and all that. So maybe for us, this is at the micro level, but it is something, at least to do something, or to start from somewhere where we can actually make a change. In the MA, I teach another class, which is related to bilingualism and bilingual education. And in that sense, then I can ask them, for example, to bring examples of activities that they can include where they have a multicultural classroom. Because when they are here in Guanajuato, they are studying the MA and they might think that they have only Mexican students. But now reality hits and they said like, well, no, now I have students who come from Japan, or that they are not bilingual, they are trilingual, because they are in the process of learning Spanish as their third language. But they are in a bilingual school because that is English and Spanish, but they also speak Japanese. So then I usually encourage them in one part of the class to bring examples of activities that they can use in the classroom. For example, these activities on translanguaging, but how can they acknowledge the different language that they are exposed to when they are teaching? So then from a very micro level, this is what we can do from this teacher education program. And in relation to your second question, like what would be the addition, or like the bigger...
Let me, if I
Yes.
may, I want to hear you talk about the kind of macro, but maybe you could walk us through, because I think people are genuinely interested here on the webinar. What are the things you do in the sociolinguistics class in those lessons? Do you mind sharing an example or two before we go into the macro? Is that okay? Because I know you have great practice.
Yes.
And I be rich for us.
Yes, when we get to the unit that is related to bilingualism, I include these articles that I have published with students, or some who are here in this webinar today as well. And I organize, depending on the group, because every group is different, but it could be that in one group I organize a debate. In another class, for example, we have these discussion groups where they can actually dissect the article and say, what is your experience as English teacher, or what is similar or different from what you have experienced so far? Because in this program, we have students who are novice teachers, or even we have students who have more years of experience in teaching. So when they get to these lessons or to these units, that's when they, for me, it is very, I get very happy when they say, I had never thought about it before, but now I can see what I can do. Because it's not only about like the concepts that we discuss in social linguistics, but it is also how they apply them into their teaching practice. And this is one of them. This topic is one of them. And I think that this is something that has helped me in my teaching practice, but also has helped them in their own teaching practice. So about the second one, before I forget it, I would say that the main addition, and something that I feel very proud of, is to see now other former students who are continuing with this work at different levels. And I can tell you of my 2 stars who are here in this webinar. that they still do the research, they can talk about the topic, they present, they publish. For me, that is like the biggest satisfaction that I can have as a teacher, because for me, they are not only my former students, I consider them my colleagues, and I have a great respect for what they are doing now. So I think that this is something that, talking about Sentipensar, I mean, when I think about what they were doing when they were my students and how they make me feel how proud I am of them, that's the biggest accomplishment that I have in terms of doing research on this topic.
Well, in my case, some of the actions that I've taken to sort of give the example or to set the example, the first thing I tell my students when I walk into a classroom, it doesn't matter which topic or which subject I'm teaching, I always tell them I function in Spanglish, because that's the reality for me. So using Spanglish in the classroom is something that I do on a regular basis, and that's how I started to conduct my classes, particularly in the last 5 years. So that's something very important. I also try to give them freedom to choose if they want to present either in English, in Spanish, if they want to mix languages. So try to be as free as possible in terms of linguistic practices inside the classroom, and also introducing them and bringing in, changing the way I plan my classes to include authors that could feel as a representation of what we're studying. So for example, introducing my students, even my BA students, to Gloria and Zaldúa, some of them even cried in the classroom. They felt so connected with the readings and with the experiences narrated in her books. So I think this is something that I really enjoy doing.
Can you tell us who Gloria Anzaldúa is briefly for the audience members who might not know?
Of course, yeah, she's a border author. She was born in the border, and she writes a lot about feminism, the experience of being a Chicana in the US, having a Mexican family. She writes in Spanglish, so that's something very, very important. She writes, well, she wrote poems, and her research was mostly about the experience of being a Chicana and the use of language in different contexts, and how language and identity were something closely related to the experience of being in the border and living in these two spaces. Thinking about a particular example that I've used in my social linguistic classes as well, is this project where I ask my students to observe the linguistic practices of their families, regardless of whether the family is bilingual, trilingual, monolingual, whatever. I just tell them to start looking and listening at what goes on at the table when they're eating, when they're watching television, when they go to church, whatever activity they do, and to take notes of things that call their attention, of those interactions and those linguistic dynamics. Some of them have gotten really excited and even have taken pictures or have brought objects into the classroom, and they get really, really excited to tell about some of the words that they are using in different languages, indigenous languages, sign languages. So it's really fascinating that they start observing their context and their family differently. So that has been a project I've been really proud of. And well, in terms of research and other things that I've been doing, I've been involved in the design of this research about linguistic repertoires, which I think is something that is closely related to this idea of Sentipensar and linguistic practices and this freedom. So trying to make people aware of the many different ways in which we use language creatively, and how it's not real that we are in a monolingual world. So the fact that we constantly use different words, different expressions, even if they're mispronounced, even if they're invented sometimes, how that fits into this idea of our linguistic practices and what we can do with language to communicate, to understand the world, and to connect with people. And particularly thinking about research, for example, the fact that I can conduct bilingual researching, as I call it, or bilingual research, for example, having my interviews again in Spanglish, or having this freedom to move back and forth in different languages when I'm interviewing or when I'm interacting with participants, has been very enriching as well. And it has proven, at least in my case, to be very easy to get information and to connect with participants to share about themselves.
I'd like to ask just a little more about the idea of the sentir, corazonar, the idea of the feeling and the heart level. How do you concretely introduce that with pre-service teachers and education systems, since that's what you're advocating for? And I think you've done it well at the theoretical level, but I'm wondering what needs to happen if we take that notion as seriously as you've taken it in centering it in the presentation.
Well, it requires a lot of work on different parts of the institutions. I would say that it is first, I would say that the most important is the micro level, because that's where we can do something tangible, and later then we can move to the next levels. But at the micro level, I think that we can bring these ideas in, as Alejandra was mentioning before, first to raise awareness on students and to see like the diversity that they can face in their classroom. But besides raising awareness, I think it is also important to have this pedagogical part. I mean, like, now you recognize this, but now how are you going to treat this in the classroom? What are you going to do in terms of activities or strategies that you can follow in the classroom? So I think that this Sentipensar idea goes hand in hand. And that's why we say, I mean, we try to extend this idea of the think, feeling, and action. I mean, like, this action is what is going to bring us closer to the action, in the sense that we can see how people can work with Sentipensar. Because then the risk is to stay only with the thinking and feeling. And yes, I recognize, I'm aware of my thoughts and I'm aware of my feelings, but then what are you going to do with that? So then this extension of thinking, feeling, and doing, I think that this is the most important. In the classroom, then we can have, for example, this, what Alejandra was saying, I mean, like these discussions, or like this encouraging on translanguaging practices, or recognition of the different languages that they can incorporate into the classroom. But it is also this sensitivity and willingness of the teacher to give a little bit, or to give away certain power, because it's not everything that the teacher can do. I mean, it is also what students can do in the classroom. That's why we emphasize this word on collaboration, because it's in two ways. I mean, it's the teacher, but it is also students. So I think that the key part here is the thinking and feeling, but also doing.
It is indeed a big challenge for us in programs, and for anybody involved in programs, because we know that academia is a very violent environment, where we see different kinds of violences and different kinds of structures that need to be resisted and that are oppressive. So it's quite a challenge. Of course, we need awareness, and we need to have these conversations and to become really reflective and critical of all of these structures and oppressions and violences that go on inside the system of academia and the social system in general. And I don't think that's easy to do. It's something that we have to constantly work on, and we have to be very strong to keep resisting and to keep pushing for the bringing down of those structures. But I think little actions can go a long way in this sense. And us teachers can become a little bit more empathic, and we could start by, as Irasema was mentioning, doing those little things and having those little actions that could actually change the environment of a class, the way we set up classrooms, the way we talk to our students, the way we conduct exams, evaluations, the way we conduct our classes within this somehow violent environment. I think that that could be a way to start.
Yeah, I was enjoying the presentation, and I appreciate these ideas and the importance, Irasema, of action, which almost sounds like praxis, but it's not the same. I realize that, but I was thinking about the ambivalences that you all described, and the hidden natures, and it suddenly underscored the importance of the feeling level of all these experiences that returnee transnational youth and families have in ways that maybe go without saying, but and I've done so much research, like so many of us, or who have embodied it, but just acknowledging how deeply loaded with feeling that those ambivalences and experiences and oversights and lacks of acknowledgement, like the teacher who said, "Oh, I didn't know you did both," like Rebelde and Nickelodeon and Britney Spears and, the Latin pop music. So it's, I think it's an important area to keep exploring, the Sentipensar. And I think there's a lot to be taught. I mean, I was with an Egyptian student who's very transnational today. He was helping me get a chicken coop. And, he's a doctoral student of mine. He would die 1,000 deaths that I'm mentioning him probably, but he was saying, "Am I ever going to fit in?" And I said, "No, I do this research. I'm really sorry." And he said, "But am I going to have a country there I belong to anymore?" And he's lived in both off and on, in his adult life too. And I said, "No, but you need to think that you're from both, right? And that you do belong to both. But it's still, now that I said, "Well, the problem is you know too much about how to think about things differently." And he's studied similar bodies of literature that we're talking about here. And he said, "That's what I was afraid of." I said, "Well, better to know than to not know and just be stuck," which is, I think, another phenomenon that merits our consideration for those of us who are concerned about transnational people. What's happening when they can't name these phenomena, right? All the feeling level that's like a genie in a bottle, that it's quite real, but, maybe goes without language, perhaps, to engage, which is why I am, so excited about this presentation and the tools and ideas that you're bringing to educators who care so passionately, educators and students who are also educators about these phenomena. I don't know if you have additional thoughts or comments that you want to bring about this conversation or my comments.
No, we're just happy to present these ideas, and this is something that we are working on. And now that we are in the same program now, then it means that we can do something more concrete in this particular teacher education program. But hopefully it will it will have an echo in other universities as well.
Well, for sure. And, we have this recording. And Alejandra, I don't know if you have some words you'd like to say before I kind of close up our discussion here.
Oh, just to thank everyone for having us tonight, and I hope this has opened up a space for you to keep reflecting on these important issues.
Thank you so much to both of you for this fantastic presentation. And as I said, it's recorded, and everyone who came to tonight's session and who even signed up will get a copy of the recording. And please distribute it broadly for, the good of the world, right? And all these transnational folk who deserve to be understood through their, as seres sentipensantes. Thank you for the important theorizing you've done. It's really spurred a lot of important thoughts and feelings within me. And I'll tell you all who are here presenting and our members in the audience, might be interested to know, we have an invited presentation on May the, sorry, I had it right here, 7th, 2023. Okay, so spring, with Mario Lopez Gopar in Oaxaca at the Universidad Autónoma Benito Juárez de Oaxaca, Mexico. And his session, again, it'll be May 7th, Sunday at 6 p.m. Mexico time, 7 p.m. Eastern time. It's called Ayuk Multilingual Practices, Challenging Western Ontologies, Epistemologies, and Language in Oaxaca, Mexico. And he's presenting the life stories of 3 self-identified Ayuk Jaya, I hope I'm saying that right, they're considered people of the mountain flowery language. Using decolonial and epistemology of the South theories, he argues that these speakers' multilingual practices challenge Western ontological, epistemological, and linguistic constructs as they resist binaries and go beyond humanism. So probably several of you in the audience are familiar with his work in Mexico, and as it has crossed borders. So it'll be a real treat to get to have him in the center series. He's our first ever invited presentation, actually. And I'm delighted that we're bringing someone from the Global South as our first invited presenter. So, because I feel like we really need to pay a lot more attention to these ways of theorizing, feeling, and thinking about people and learning, right? I feel like our answers are there more so than in the West. I'm just sitting here in the United States facilitating, okay? So, muchísimas gracias a todos los que han venido, a los que han prestado un poco de sus vidas cortas aquí, and especially to our presenters, Doctora Alejandra Núñez Asomoza, and Doctora Irasema Mora-Pablo from the esteemed Universidad de Guanajuato in Mexico. It's been a real treat, and it's just been such a pleasure and an honor being able to host you all here. And we will have another 1 or 2 in the spring, but the times aren't nailed down. But the one with Dr. Mario Lopez Gopar is nailed down for May 7th. So we'll be sending information about that and distributing flyers and stuff too. So I hope you all have a great evening or day, depending on where you're tuning in from. And it's been great having you here. And cuídense mucho. Take good care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.